You know, for many of you, your first encounter with gender mechanics in Pokemon games might have been from the very first of them by seeing Nidoran male and Nidoran female. Gender mechanics in Pokemon games have never been too out of place. We can all see them, and there's many instances of female-only Pokemon and male-only Pokemon. Nidoran, though, is an interesting one because of Gen 1 mechanics. Because gender wasn't introduced until Gen 2, Nidoran ended up as being listed as two different species in the Pokedex, one for each gender. And there's numerous Pokemon who, as I mentioned, are listed as male-only or female-only. Even up to where we are today, Gen 9, with the three troublemakers of Okidogi, Munkidori, and Pheasantipiti listed as only male Pokemon, and Ogerpon as only female. But I don't want to focus on these clear examples of gender mechanics in this way. I want to look at the more subtle ones. The gender difference mechanics Game Freak used to love to do when creating Pokemon, and took a lot of personality and drew from life in order to get them, and nowadays it has ceased to exist in the same way that it used to. You may already be aware of sexual dimorphism in animals, and how that has made its way to the Pokemon series as well. Between Gen 1 and 4, there's a ton of Pokemon with subtle changes to them based on gender. But after Gen 4, Game Freak all but stopped its barrage of tiny details that would make things different based on gender, and they opted to produce a super limited batch of Pokemon with gender differences, and those differences were gonna stand out like a flashbang. Hell, in Gen 7 we got 0 gender different Pokemon. In Gen 8 we got the same limited supply of highly noticeable gender different Pokemon, and then in Gen 9 we have the cursed Oinkologne line. Only one! It wasn't until I was playing the Indigo Disc, running around, chasing Doduo, that like my sister was like saying something as in, hey look, that one's a female or something. And I was like, wait, how do you know off the bat? And the tiny subtle detail I was missing or forgot about in memory was that the Doduo and Dodrio have that gender difference, where male Doduo have black necks and female Doduo have like tannish regular ones, and it carries over to the other evolved forms of them. This tiny subtle detail was something I was like unaware of until it was pointed out. I totally forgot that Pokemon does this. And it reminded me of all the subtle differences you might be able to see on certain Pokemon in the game, because thankfully we have all the sprites and updated, and like you can see them clear as day. It's great. So I want to go over the Pokemon with these gender differences and show off some of the ones that, you might know already. Well, basically all of them. Some you might know clearly already, but there's many you probably haven't ever noticed at all. I know I never had. I'm also going to include gameplay footage of, within the game, if you're able to get it within the game. There's a couple that you can't quite in Gen 9 Scarlet Violet, but we'll go over them. So yeah, I think it'll be lots of fun. And let's begin. Firstly, I wanted to point out the newest feature gained in the Indigo Disc DLC. One of the new features, because there was a lot introduced. It was pointed out to me that if you contribute 200 BP to the Photography Club, they will enhance your lock-on feature to include being able to tell the Pokemon's gender, size, and if it has a mark or not on Pokemon you've already caught. This feature is great if you're trying to, look for size comparisons, look for marks, or look for male and female Pokemon and being clear with it. And generally, it was very helpful with this. So yeah, let's get to the actual Pokemon. So the list begins with Pokemon number 1, that's Venusaur. So one of the starters. We actually have, 3 starters, including Venusaur, that has some differences? Venusaur have long tree things on their back that has the big flower, but the male Venusaur have shorter ones than what the females have. Although it might be tricky to see, especially since I think my female one might be small, I don't know, but you can kind of see that little difference being wedged between the tops of the trees. It's very interesting. One seems to be a little chubbier and one is a little more narrow, it looks like. Then we hop to Butterfree, and Butterfree happens to change one specific shaded area. Rattata and Raticate both share the difference in whiskers. Both female versions of Rattata or Raticate possess smaller whiskers. Pikachu is an obvious one that most of us already know, with a regular male Pikachu having that traditional tail, and the female one having a heart-shaped tail instead. Raichu's also rather obvious, with the males having normal-looking tails, and the female ones having a notched one, like a feral cat or animal. Seriously, I'd really dislike the idea of female Raichu having part of its tail, the top of its tail, like just kind of cut off like that. The design just looks so weird to me, I gotta say. But nonetheless, that is one difference that I'm sure most of us already know of and can tell. But then we see the previously mentioned mascots of Nidoran, and then we move to Zubat and Crobat in this Pokedex, where the females have smaller fangs. Then I moved on to search for Gloom in the game because this was one I totally never noticed. Male Gloom have small spots all over their petals. I guess those big spherical things are called petals. And the female Gloom have one big spot per petal. One! I was so shocked I never really noticed this. And it continues to Vileplume too. This is one difference that was so foggy until now because I'd seen both before, but male Vileplume have smaller spots and the female have really huge spots. And I love those really huge spots. And it awakens memories of seeing it in past games. How could I miss this? You know, I always love seeing the big spots, and then if I saw smaller spots, I'd be like, you know, was I imagining the other? No, there are these slight differences. The next differences were with Kadabra and Alakazam. Both have mustaches, and the female, both of them, have a smaller mustache than the male version. Then, the Doduo and Dodrio line that I talked about briefly earlier, the difference in the necks. I remember after learning about this, I really wanted to shiny hunt one for each gender, and I was able to. It's so clear to see now the males have really accented necks like I remember them being black, and the females are a bit more plain. But side by side, it's awesome to see these little differences. Hypno is next, with the female having longer collar fur, which is super interesting. Once again, a detail I never really noticed. Then we jump back to the savannah in the game to see Rhyhorn, and the difference in horns, of course. Females having the smaller horn. The same carries over to Rhydon, where the female Rhydon is still with a small horn. If you look at both of them together, you can clearly see the size difference in horns. And then if they were to go up to Rhyperior, which I didn't have any on hand, but the Rhyperior is able to show off the head spike being larger or not. And then the same carries over to Fish. We get to see Goldeen and Seaking have horn differences. What we're seeing with these examples are clear examples of pulling from sexual dimorphism in animals by seeing the female with smaller parts in some cases. So it's definitely rooted in some research and stuff. Then another big case of pulling from actual real life is shown with the female Scyther having a larger abdomen. Finally, we get to see a female with a noticeably larger part, and this lines up with real life, with bugs where the female would have the larger parts. Thankfully, we can see it with Scizor too, but unfortunately, I hate to burst your bubble, but it looks like it wasn't carried over to Kleavor. It probably would have been awesome to have been, but as I said, this is a dying art. Game Freak doesn't do this much anymore, and so it's good to see them while we can with certain Pokemon. But back to Kanto again, we see another change I didn't notice until looking at a list. It's Magikarp. Basic Magikarp. It's how their whiskers are different. Male Magikarp actually have yellow whiskers, and the females have white whiskers. I always figured they all had yellow whiskers for some reason, and that's just kind of what was in my head. And so seeing the white ones now clear as day, the difference, it kind of surprised me. I can't believe this went over my head for so long. And it carries over after evolving into Gyarados too, where the male Gyarados would have blue whiskers and the female continues to have white whiskers. I gotta ask, if you got yourself a shiny Gyarados, does it have red whiskers or does it have some white whiskers? Boy or girl? Looking at these subtle but in-your-face differences totally makes me rethink all the encounters I've had with them over the years. Isn't it cool to see? Last of the Kanto differences lies with Eevee, which is also an obvious one, that, like Pikachu, is a weird change to make down the road. But we see with Eevee, the males have kind of a cream-colored tip spiked on the tail, and the female ones have a curved, almost heart-shaped, lighter tip on the tail. Very noticeable. And then Gen 2. Gen 2 introduces another starter Pokemon with a difference. We got starter number 2. It's Meganium, with male Meganium having longer antennae than the female ones. Look at this. It's a pretty clear difference. The male's antennae are so long, they seem to be able to curve down and back up. And the female has ones that just kind of are straight and curved, but they don't quite go as far as the males. But speaking of antenna, we got more differences when it comes to Lediba and Ledian, where the females have smaller antenna on them compared to the male. Xatu is a super interesting change because it doesn't have to do so much with a body part that changes, maybe, but rather it's just a single stripe. If you look closely, you can see that male Xatu have 3 yellow body stripes, while the females only have 2. Interesting, right? Sudowoodo can be observed as having a smaller branch atop its head if it's female rather than male. And then we move on to another surprise I saw while looking at this, and that's with Politoed. Surprisingly, female Politoads actually have smaller cheeks than their male counterparts. I really adore those big cheeks a lot, but it's so cool to see the difference again with these two that I had never noticed before. Aipom has the distinct features of its head fur being shorter on males this time, rather than females. Then we get to look at the cool differences in Wooper. We're talking our good old blue Wooper, where the males have 2 gill branches, I guess that's what they're called, and the females only having 1. I was surprised to see it, and the female ones, it feels like it's almost lacking in it, but I never really noticed until now. But it was awesome to see. Then when they evolve, you can also see that male Quagsire have their usual dorsal ridge, where females have a smaller version of it. Once again, never really knew this Pokemon knowledge. We're going deep into the lore and, the differences. The thing caught me off guard. I never knew this about Quagsire, and the Wooper thing caught me by surprise. It's a bummer they couldn't continue this with Paldean, Wooper, and Clodsire, though. Yeah, so we could have had, an extra bone or something. And Clodsire also has a ridge of sorts that could differ based on gender, but unfortunately, we don't really get to see these subtle changes any longer. Boo-hoo! Murkrow's one I'm not the biggest fan of for the females, because seeing the female have a smaller hat part makes it look a little more silly in my opinion. I love the big hat on male Murkrows. I always figured in my head all the Murkrow need a big hat part. But no, some of the females do not. The female ones have a smaller hat part than the males. Next in the Pokedex would be Wobbuffet, and that's another obvious one I'm sure we're all aware of because it really stands out. It's unique. The male is, normal looking, we all know that, but the female has lipstick, which is certainly an interesting choice. I don't know what they were thinking with that. Is there anybody who does love that? You'll have to let me know. Then there's Girafarig, with a difference in the yellow sections. So female Girafarigs... What? Female Girafarigs have a longer yellow section to them. At first, I was thinking that, the male might just have bigger yellow spots than the female, but no, it looks to be that the yellow section is just a bit longer. And once again, so cool to see once it's pointed out. But we also still don't see any change in Farigiraf, which is a shame. I think it'd be awesome to keep this going by doing something. But, alas, we didn't get anything like that. And so it's up to us. What do you think you would make or draw for an alternate looking gender difference on Farigiraf? I'd be curious. But we can see more body differences in Gligar, where the males have a normal looking stinger, which is like pretty big already, but the females have a smaller stinger. This once again is pretty obvious when you put them side by side and whatnot, and I guess you can take your pick of which stinger Gligar you're liking. Steelix is one I also thought was really interesting because I never noticed before. It has male Steelix with 2 outer teeth, let's say, and the female with just 1. Heracross comes in with another obvious difference that I think we all know about. So here we go, where the male looks like a normal beetle kind of thing, and the female has a clear heart shape to their horn pattern, which makes it really easy to tell at a glance if they're female or male. Same thing goes for Sneasel, another clear one. I think we're used to seeing a large feather associated with males and the small feather with females. I never really liked the small feather on the female. I like that long feather, but I'm sure there's a lot of people who prefer the little one and think it's really cute. What's really interesting too is that Hisuian Sneasel also carries that variant where the males have a longer feather and the females have a shorter one. This is super interesting because it seems Hisuian Sneasel is like the only variant that carries over the gender difference, like that they share it. That's definitely interesting. Ursaring can be seen with longer shoulder fur on the females, and for Piloswine, as expected, the females have smaller tusks. And then that carries over to Mamoswine as well. Once you evolve them, you get to see a male with bigger tusks and a female with smaller ones. Definitely sticks out when they're side by side. Same with Octillery, where the females actually have smaller suction cups. Then comes the one my sister dunks on, and it's the horn difference in Houndoom. I actually got a random shiny Houndour in a group of them while running up to check for comparison to catch some, and it turned out to be a female. The females have smaller horns than the males do, and at least for my sis, they look a little pathetic in comparison, or silly, let's say. And then lastly, for Gen 2, we get to see more tusk differences in Donphan, the last of the Johto Pokemon with these differences. And as expected, the female has these shorter tusks that you can see. Now then, it would move to Generation 3, where this continues to stand strong. Once again, we have a starter to start with, and it's Torchic. Torchic is actually interesting in this because it is the only one with like a full line of, it's the only starter with a full line of differences. Starting with Torchic, I think most of us know by now, but the male has just a random black speck on its rear. And that is the difference, seeing it on the sprite, but even seeing it in game. There was some instances where I had to zoom in and it could be all kind of blurry, but you could still make out that it's there and you're like, oh yeah, that's my male Torchic right over there. And then other times, yeah, you just pay attention. If you're going to catch some, maybe you want to keep an eye out for it. And then with the females, they just don't have it. So that's the difference for them. And then once they evolve into Combusken, we get to see more difference in sizing. So the female has smaller head feathers rather than the male. The male has some pretty big ones. Female has the smaller ones. And then once you evolve those up as well, we get more difference. Turns out, the male crest is really long and awesome looking, but the female crest is smaller. Once again, very obvious change. You can see that if you put them side by side. And like I said, I'm having fun putting them side by side and looking at these differences. It's like now you can rethink if you want a Blaziken that's male or female, basically long-haired, short hair. Then it's Beautifly, where the male has longer red markings on the upper wings. With Dustox, it looks like the female have smaller antennae, which is super interesting. And then it moves to Ludicolo, which is also a really interesting choice with the difference here. So regular male Ludicolo are the ones with these really thick stripes on its body, and the female Ludicolo are the ones with the thinner stripes on the body. Then we get to see Nuzleaf and the difference in the leaves, where, as expected, the female has a smaller leaf. And then Shiftry, it carries over. The female has smaller leaves. Then on to Meditite. So Meditite is once again, never noticed this before, but super interesting to see now. The male's ears are higher. First, let me just say, those are ears? I guess so. And the males are higher. And then once it evolves into Medicham, the differences carry over, where the male has a larger bulb on its head than the female one, and once again, it's very quite noticeable. Roselia has the female's body leaf being longer. Gulpin, I couldn't get because I was playing in Scarlet, and oh my goodness, so the difference between Gulpin and Swallow, Gulpin has the female feather is being shorter, and then Swallow has the female having shorter whiskers. I was looking for these for so long in Scarlet because I knew the location because I'd played Violet, and I realized way too late that it's Scarlet, it's not in Scarlet, so oh great. Numel is then seen with the female having a larger hump, and this is one difference that's like super hard to recognize. It's so subtle. And then with Camerupt, same deal. Female has larger humps. And at least in this, designs and things, the 3D models, you can kind of see, if you look at their humps closely, you can see the female has kind of some higher ones. Then there's Cacturn, another one that, hey, my sis would say it's obvious, but to me it wasn't so obvious. I wasn't paying attention. So the females have a large diamond on their chest, where the male only has small ones. I always figured, like, the male ones were just what Cacturn looks like, until, like, really opening my eyes to the female one that just has a huge triangle, or huge diamond shape. Then there's Milotic, and the male's hair, like fins, are shorter than the females. I really love this. It's very clear to see, and once again, it's something to consider. If you want to get yourself a female Milotic to have that hair really flow in the wind, let's say, when it does that weird thing and sticks way straight out, or maybe you want the male version where that doesn't get in the way so much. It's up to you. And then lastly, Gen 3 ends with a Relicanth, where the female has a shorter jaw guard. Once again, detail I would have never seen on my own. Then Generation 4, and I think Generation 4 is the one Game Freak really went ham on this mechanic thing. They are going for it, and I like that they did. Starting with Starly, the female's forehead marking is smaller. It's hard to see, but you can kind of tell that the female's one is a little smaller. And then that carries over for the whole line. The Staravia line to have female's forehead spot being smaller, and then you have with Staraptor the female's forehead spot being smaller. Look at these subtle things. You might have known this one, or at least Staraptors, but either way, it's super interesting. Then with Bidoof, apparently the male's tail has 2 additional curls to it. And then on Babarrel, the mask has 2 additional curls for the male. Then there was Kricketot and Kricketune. With Kricketot, you're able to see that the female has a larger collar. Super interesting. When I set up a picnic and brought these guys out, even like an aerial view, you can clearly see the difference there, and that's cool. And then with Kricketune, the female has a smaller mustache, as you might expect. But yeah, you can totally tell that the male has a pretty long mustache and the female has a much shorter one. Then we have an interesting line with the Shinx. So, if you didn't know, females have blue hind feet and a shorter mane. I'm not too interested in the shorter mane, but you can see that males are just like, the whole back end is black and the paw's black, but the females have a blue hind foot. It's so cute. But if you want to get even more subtle, go to Luxio, where the female has exposed rear ankles and a shorter mane. Don't talk to me about anything. Look at the ankle shots with these two. Never would I be guessing that that's the difference. Oh my goodness. That's a Pokemon quiz for you right there. Then with Luxray, it kind of chills out. Goes back to clearly recognizable, where the female's mane is just smaller than the male's. Next is Roserade, who has a longer cape if it's female. Then Combi. We all kind of know Combi already, and how it works. We have the male's lower face having no red mark, and the also added fact that only female Combi can evolve into Vespiquen. Super interesting. Pachirisu. So apparently with Pachirisu, not only do they have this little stripe on its head, but it changes in shape. Because the female's head stripe is shorter Have you noticed that? Give me my male one with the big significant stripe, but I didn't know about that. The other Pachirisu info, goodness. With Buizel, this is another one I'm kind of ashamed to say, but I did not know of really or notice until nowish, that the females have one less light-colored spot on their back. So I always figured Buizel had just the 2 spots, let's say, on its back, but no, the females have only 1, and it carries over to Floatzel as well. You see the 2 of the male, and then the female has 1 less light-colored bump on its back. Super interesting. Ambipom is carrying over from Apom, where the male has shorter head fur. And then we get to another line, which is Gible, which is an interesting one. It's cool. The males have a notched dorsal fin, and this carries over to the other evolutions as well. You'll see it with Gabite, where the female has kind of a smooth one, and then the male has a notched. And then it'll carry into Garchomp as well, where the male has that notched dorsal fin, and the female does not. What do you associate Garchomp with? It's interesting info. One that I had noticed, though, of course, is Hippopotas. We all have, though, because the female color pattern is actually inverted. It's very different from the male. These are really cool. And then Hippowdon, we have the male body being a light brown and the females being like a bluish gray. Then with Krogunk, we have females have higher bandages. Bandages in quotes, not sure what they are, but if you look closely, they're higher for the females. And then Toxicroak, the female's vocal sac is smaller. Then is Finneon. Finneon? Okay. Female has larger bottom tail fins. And then once that thing evolves into Lumineon, the female has longer fins. Also kind of a subtle one to notice, but once you notice it, you notice it. And you can take your pick on which gender you'd like, with the female having those long ones. Then comes another kind of obvious one that we all know of, I think, but also confused me as a kid for a while, was Bisnover and their weird pattern. So the males have like more of a brown pattern, and the female's midsection, instead of it being brown, it's white. And that is our difference. It's pretty clear to see. Then when they evolve, it's not as clear to see, but there's still a difference. The female has longer chest fur than the male. Then is Weavile, where the female's ears are shorter. As mentioned with Rhyperior, you get to see the female with a smaller horn, it being not its drill, but the upper horn. With Tangrowth, this one's weird. It's got male with, usual fingers, but the female finger markings are longer. And they just look like such long fingers. It's freaky. Lastly, for Gen 4 is Mamoswine, as we mentioned, and the female having smaller tusks. Then we get into Gen 5, and this is where Game Freak fell off and stopped, reeled this back. They didn't completely stop, but they reeled it back. We only have 3 to cover. Well, yeah. Let's get into it. So we have Unfezant, where the male and female are very clearly distinct. I like it. I like the idea of an early route bird Pokemon having it such a difference. It's just too bad the design, I guess, and the Pokemon kind of fell flat with fans maybe. Even now, I'm kind of but I applaud them for doing such an obvious difference between the two and following from real life animals and stuff. Then with Frillish, once again, we are back to the basic clear gender difference. How can we get more clear than blue and pink, boy and girl, with Frillish and Jellicent? Then in Gen 6, gets cut even more. We only got 2, and it's once again very, very, very obvious. We have the classic case of lions having that dimorphism, where the female has this sick mohawk behind it and stuff, and the male having that huge mane. Then you can see with Meowstic, I really love their differences. They are once again very distinct Pokemon, very distinct genders as well. Mine, they're usually blue, of course. Forgive mine for being shiny, yellowish, but they are a favorite of mine. Generation 8. That's right. Generation 7 has been obliterated. There's no gender dimorphism happening in Gen 7, and that makes me so sad. They had opportunities. They could do some, but they didn't. But that's okay. Let's go to Gen 8. Gen 8 has 2. We have, of course, obvious ones. Male and female indeedy, with a clear difference in design and purpose and everything like that. Then we have the Basculegion Pokemon that is new and all, and that one also has some very clear differences with it. I really adore the female being this color and everything to do with it, rather than the big red, but yeah, they're both cool. And then lastly, we have Gen 9 we have right now. What did we get? I think I already mentioned it, but we got Oinkologne. Male, female differences there. So yeah, that's the Pokemon you can get. There's a number of these. I want to say most of these you can certainly find yourself in the game and get them. And maybe you want to get one of each gender too and compare, or keep this info in mind or be conscious of it. Or if anything, I hope you were entertained by it. This was interesting to research and it was really fun to go into, and I learned a lot. Hope you did too. If I missed anything, let me know, but otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye!